In this video, we'll go through how to identify common audio formats, how to handle them, and assess what their preservation risk is. In part 1, we'll cover analog discs, part 2, magnetic tape, and part 3, optical discs. Just to begin with, here's a basic overview on storage. The usual archive storage conditions apply of clean, out of direct sunlight, and cool and dry with minimal fluctuations. Therefore, archival storage conditions appropriate to paper-based materials are often fine. It's more keeping the temperature and humidity stable is the most important factor. For home collections, a cool, room temperature or below, relatively dry, about 35 to 40% relative humidity, clean and stable environment, so avoiding attics, cellars and other locations where high risks of flood or extreme temperatures. As for how to store the items on the shelves, all discs and tape should stand vertically without having to bear any weight on them. Any storage boxes should be made of acid-free paper stock and should avoid storage containers that retain any static charge. Airtight containers are best avoided as these create a microclimate that can encourage mold growth and accelerate degradation. Mold is a real danger to audio materials and can be difficult to address, so it's best to prevent it from forming in the first place. An example where you can prevent this is to throw away any plastic bags surrounding reel-to-reel tapes inside their boxes. Any PVC sleeve in direct contact with a vinyl disc should also be removed and replaced with an acid-free paper or polyester sleeve. Ideally, discs should be housed in a high-density polyethylene sleeve. The Preservation Self-Assessment Programme recommends that, as a rule of thumb, bad plastic sleeves are clear and have a sticky or tacky feel, and good sleeves are frosted in appearance and have a slippery feel. If a box or sleeve needs to be replaced, it's important to document any metadata that they contain, such as the content information or technical notes. Part 1. Analog discs. All grooved disc media is susceptible to warpage, breakage, groove wear and surface contamination. As they are all prone to wear and tear through repeated playing or handling, you should handle the groove disc by the edge and the label areas only. Oils and grease from your fingers can seriously degrade the playing surface, so you should avoid touching the grooves as a matter of priority. There are 3 overall formats of analog discs that you could have in your collections, so it's good to identify what are the properties of each as they have completely different playback equipment and different conservation issues. For instance, you must never try to play a shellac record on a vinyl player or stylus, as not only will it not sound very good, it will likely damage it. Vinyl will likely be the one we're most familiar with its production dating back from the 1940s to the present day. It's made of PVA and PVC copolymer and is usually black and shiny in appearance. There's the long-playing LP record, the extended play EP record, or the single. These terms are often used interchangeably with the revolutions per minute, or RPM, required to play the record. So a 12-inch LP plays at 33 1/3 rotations per minute, and a 7-inch single plays at 45 rotations per minute, and is therefore sometimes called a 45. Vinyl discs are especially prone to scratches and abrasions due to their relatively soft material. Also, high humidity and temperatures can adversely affect these discs by creating prime conditions for mold. High temperatures may also cause the plastics to soften and warp, reducing playability and audio quality. They need to be kept out of direct sunlight, as mentioned before. If stored in PVC sleeves, it's important for them not to have contact with the disc, as is often the case with picture discs, as this causes a chemical reaction which results in irreversible audible damage. If vinyl is stored well, it's chemically stable and considered a low preservation risk, with professional playback equipment readily available. Shellac discs were produced in the 1890s up to the 1960s and feel much heavier than vinyl. As well as being prone to the usual wear and tear, shellac is particularly prone to breakage as it is brittle and will literally crack under pressure. It's not flexible at all like vinyl is. Shellac discs are often either 7-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch and 16-inch. They are typically played back at the following speeds: 30, 70 and 78 RPM. Shellac is often seen as a 10-inch 78. Early 78s were often not cut at exactly 78 rotations per minute, so correct speed may not be standardized from one disc to the next. Additionally, groove size varies, so a variety of different styli are necessary to ensure that the stylus used is not too small or wide, which can adversely affect playback quality or irreparably damage the disc. Therefore, shellac discs are prone to wear and tear through repeated playing or handling. However, the preservation risk is similarly considered to be low, as when stored correctly, they are chemically stable. The major difference in their preservation status from vinyl is that specialist playback equipment is not widely available, and a level of expertise is required to play them back correctly. Lacquer discs are also generally black in appearance but occasionally clear. They were produced from the 1930s onwards and were either made of cellulose nitrate or gelatine resin, surrounding a metal, glass, or card-based disc. To identify them, they often have handwritten or typed labels that are glued rather than the mass-produced printed ones that require no adhesive. This is because they are individually cut, so the contents are often unique. What's significant about these discs is that they should be considered extremely high risk, preservation-wise, not just because of their unique content, but also because their chemical stability is very poor. They are heavier and more brittle than vinyl, but lighter than shellac. However, the weight is depending on the core material, as if it's metal, it would weigh more than card. If its core material is metal, it can also feel more cold than other analog discs. If you look at the central hole at an angle, you might be able to see the core material under the resin coating. This could look like a glint of metal or brown paper-like material. If you shine a light source upwards from beneath the disc and the disc appears translucent, it's most likely glass. If you do this, it's essential that the light source that you use does not emit any heat, as this can damage a lacquer disc surface after only a few seconds exposure. Conservation issues with lacquer discs include delamination and plasticizer degradation, which both can intersect, resulting in audible surface degradation. If stored in a humid atmosphere, the plasticizer can extrude from the resin, and then the surface material contracts, leading to delamination. This has the appearance of white dusty coating that looks like mold. Again, according to the Preservation Self-Assessment Program at Illinois University, the best way to determine if the contamination is mold is to observe the surface under a microscope. If the contaminant looks fuzzy or lattice-like, it is most likely mold. If it has a more oily or crystalline appearance, this is likely an acid that has formed on the disc surface. The rate of this deterioration is unpredictable. Also, metal and card-based discs are susceptible to bending, and glass-based discs are brittle. Part 2. Magnetic tape. Magnetic tape has included various formats since its first form, which was magnetic wire recording, invented in Germany in 1928. In this section, we'll be looking closely at 3 common formats that you might have within your collections: open reel, audio cassette, and DAT, as well as being stored according to the guidance already given of cool, clean, dry, and stable. All magnetic tape needs to be kept away from potential sources of demagnetization. Magnetic fields generated by power supplies, automatic door locks, vacuum cleaners, loudspeakers, and lightning conductors can negatively affect the magnetic information recorded on the tapes, audibly degrading the content. Open reel is a magnetic tape wound onto reels between 3 and 14 inches in diameter, although 5, 7, and 10.5 inch reels are by far the most popular. They are usually stored on reels with a centre spindle hole, or with larger professional reels sometimes they have an open core. The tape itself is made up of several layers sandwiched together, the base layer being usually made of polyester, acetate, or occasionally PVC. You can identify this by holding the reel up to the light. Acetate will appear translucent and polyester will be opaque, but please note that this is true for audio only, and that the opposite can be seen in film reels. Handling advice is to hold by the edge of the plastic or metal reel, the flanges, and centre hub only, and not to squeeze the flanges together, which will crush the tape pack in between. Ideally, open reels should be stored in boxes with supports for the hub so that the entire weight of the reel is not on the edge of the reel. As for their chemical stability, if polyester-based tapes are stored well, it is considered to be chemically stable, but the binder layer in tapes made from the 1970s onwards can become sticky and cause irreversible damage if played. This is because it can leave a gummy residue over the machine, and the friction can cause the oxide layer that contains the audio signal to literally shred away in small shards. This is often called sticky shed syndrome and is part of a wider issue called soft binder syndrome. Acetate tapes can off-gas acetic acid, which leads to them smelling of vinegar. This is particularly if they have been stored in humid conditions. The effect of this can cause the base layer to become extremely brittle, and also the binder layer may shrink, causing the tape to contort into a warped or cup shape, and the tape pack to display a characteristic spoking pattern, all of which has a negative impact on replay sound quality. The preservation risk for the open reel format is high, with acetate being considered even higher risk than polyester. Also, professional replay equipment has not been made for some time. Spare parts are increasingly hard to obtain. Equipment maintenance expertise is also hard to find, which may be the biggest issue here. In identifying what tape you have, it's important to consider that there are a variety of recording speeds: mono, stereo, full, half track, or quarter track widths. No single machine is capable of replaying all of these variants. The audiocassette was developed by the company Philips in 1963 and was in regular use up until the 2000s. It takes the form of polyester tape held within a protective shell, generally utilising a single standardised speed and recording format. Widely held in archives, both with mass-produced, pre-recorded content and also unique and rare individually recorded content. Many recordings utilise proprietary noise reduction technology such as Dolby, requiring equivalent technology to be used to correctly replay the content. The same chemical issues affect cassettes as with other polyester tape. No professional replay equipment has been made for some time, and spare parts are increasingly hard to obtain. And again, equipment maintenance expertise is hard to find. Therefore, the preservation risk is considered high. Over the years, there became 4 types of audiocassette, and it's useful to learn how to identify them and update this information in your inventory, just as you would if you found out what type of CD, CDR, CD-ROM that you're caring for. The introduction of each type of audiocassette was a not always successful attempt to improve on the qualities of the previous type. Each type is a completely different chemical property and audio quality. Just as the choice of a particular format can be a clue to the time of recording, so can the type of audiocassette tape used. Type 1 is often the most common type and is sometimes called normal type, and it's made of ferric oxide. It has small notches on the top corners where the over-recording protection tab can and should be removed to protect the recording on the tape. Type 2 is made from chromium dioxide and is the second most likely tape in your archive collections. It has slightly longer notches around that tab. This shape of notch is also a method for some players to automatically adjust to the settings required for each tape. Type 3 is pretty rare, so it's not even in this image. It was an attempt to combine the properties of ferric and chrome that was ultimately not successful. The image in the bottom right corner shows a label from one of these tapes. As for Type 4, these cassettes are made using a layer of metal particles. See those 2 notches that are more towards the middle on the top side of the cassette shell? They were introduced as an additional method for some players to automatically adjust to the settings required. Inside a cassette shell. The shell contains several moving parts and may be subject to degradation, including a loss of adhesion in the glue holding the pressure pad or loss of lubrication on the so-called slip sheets that allow the tape to move freely. This format is particularly prone to wear and tear through repeated playing or handling. Longer duration cassettes are typically made out of a thinner base material, increasing the risk of irreversible stretching or becoming tangled with poorly performing replay devices. Often the most common basic repair is where the tape becomes crumpled or twisted. Hand winding the tape with a biro is still the best method to untangle or smooth this out. Try and be extra careful with repaired tapes. Play from start to finish with no unnecessary rewinding or fast forwarding. The next most common repair is to reposition the pressure pad, or because the tape has become disconnected from the supply reel. For repairs like these, you would need to carefully unscrew the cassette shell and either reposition the part, or if broken, transfer the tape into a new shell. Another common issue is for the tape to become detached from the take-up reel. If you look closely at this image of the take-up reel, you can see a small detachable part that slides out. You just need to push this out and trap the end of the tape underneath again before sliding the part back in. Repairs like this require clean hands, a tidy desk and some precision screwdrivers. Make sure the windows close and that there's no chance of any passing drafts. Even a big exhale of breath can make the tape unravel out of position. Digital audio tape, or DAT, was invented by the Sony Corporation and introduced in 1987. Although digital, the storage of the content is still by magnetic means and is therefore susceptible to the same degradation as all other magnetic tape formats. DAT tape is similar in its chemical construction and recording methods to videotape. In fact, it is very easy to confuse a DAT tape with the slightly smaller mini DV videotape. As with video, these tapes are highly susceptible to wear and tear through playing and handling. They should be kept clean and in their original cases, and the best orientation for a cassette is vertical and on its end. Cassettes and cartridges should be stored upright on shelves like books. The preservation risk for them is considered high, as no professional replay equipment has been made for some time, and again, spare parts and maintenance are hard to acquire. Stenograph and dictation tapes. Grundig developed an early dictation device called the Stenograph in 1954, which in turn became a widely used method for business-based audio recording through the 60s and 70s, in the form of a cartridge like in this image. In the late 70s to the early 80s, their standard device had moved on to the Steno Cassette 30. These formats can really only be played back in their original playback machines, such as the Grundig Stenograph R dictaphone, so this makes them difficult to find working equipment for. The microcassette was introduced to the consumer market in 1969 by Olympus and is a common format used in voice dictation ansophones, and some oral history collections. Microcassettes and mini-cassettes are very thin and therefore are highly at risk from stretching and breaking. This means these formats are especially vulnerable during playback, and they're also at the risk of being accidentally recorded over. Their repeated playback degrades the audio quality over time. The exceptionally vulnerable qualities of these tapes means that they are considered to have a projected lifespan of 2 to 10 years. Part 3. Optical discs. For the general storage and handling of optical discs, jewel cases are acceptable, and any broken holders for the centre of the disc should be replaced so as to protect the edges. As you would expect, you should handle by the edge and the centre hole only, and optical discs are particularly vulnerable to scratches and surface damage. You should wipe them carefully with a clean, lint-free cloth to remove any dust or fingerprints before playback, and the direction of this wiping needs to be from the centre directly outwards towards the edge. Audio CDs, also known as compact disc digital audio, have been in use from 1982 until the present day. They are mass replicated with recorded information pressed onto the silver-coloured underside. Initially used to carry audio data, the compact disc also later began to be used to store file-based content. In general, they are chemically stable if stored well. However, there are some discs that are produced in the late 1980s, early 90s that used a defective protective surface, which has resulted in visible tarnishing or bronzing of the upper surface and a reduced reflectivity of the lower surface. For many of these discs, it has rendered them partially or completely unreadable. Standalone playback equipment and computer optical drives are still available, but becoming less common on newer desktops and laptops. So it is advised to invest in a good quality external optical drive, and also to use recommended software to rip these CDs, like DB PowerAmp. For audio CDs, the preservation risk is medium, due to the likelihood of their damage. CDRs have been produced for the same length of time as CDs. However, these discs have recordings that are individually burnt onto a photosensitive dye layer, and this dye layer is liable to degrade, particularly on exposure to daylight. These discs were increasingly used for short-run productions and commercial music, and can often be difficult to distinguish from mass-replicated CDs. The dye layer is often coloured either blue-green or very pale yellow. The upper surface is less likely to contain mass-printed content information. The legibility of the data burnt on the disc is notoriously hard to determine, as poorly burnt discs may only play on certain drives or players, or become unreadable in a really short lifespan. As it's incredibly hard to predict the legibility of the data, and also the degradation of the dye layer, the preservation risk for CDRs is much higher than it is for CDs. Opto-Magnetic discs. Mini-discs were a proprietary format from the 90s to the early 2000s. They take the form of opto-magnetic discs that with the right software appear as an external disk drive when connected to a computer. They even have a similar physical appearance to computer floppy disks. Within archives, they will generally be unique individual recordings, but also they could be pre-recorded commercial mini-discs that were briefly mass-produced. Even though mini-discs are chemically stable when stored well and have minimal handling issues, it must be considered that their preservation risk is high. This is because there are significant obsolescence issues, as replay equipment is no longer available new, and the software Sonic Stage that's used to decode its 8-track data format is no longer supported. There are some open source but still unsupported workarounds to get the original Sonic Stage software to work on today's PCs. As well as the equipment being difficult to find, there's also two different systems within this audio format, NetMD and HiMD. NetMD recorders allow music files to be transferred from a computer to a recorder over a USB connection, but not in the other direction. HiMD was introduced in 2004, and it's important to note that HiMD media will not play on NetMD players. Therefore, it's best to invest in a HiMD player as it will play and allow transfer of both NetMD and HiMD media. So that completes our overview and occasional deep dive on identifying, caring for, and assessing the risk of common audio formats within many archives. We'll shortly be publishing practical user guides on the best practice for ripping audio CDs and mini-discs. These will become available on our training page on our website. The British Library have produced various handouts that summarise these formats and some of the issues inherent with them. Also, here is a list of some more in-depth resources that expand further into formats, care and risk.